Recording.
See if he shows up.
I have a few things that want.
Well, it can be next week, because it's gonna be so quite cold that they're.
I'll be in.
Thursday and Friday. I don't know.
Let you know.
I'm bringing you.
Be there.
I'll let you have all that.
Yeah.
Well, I can't keep those boys in these.
Webinar.
You and I have went through this once already.
That's true.
Do I remember?
No. First, it was probably gonna be a great event for me.
So I didn't realize too, I never realized this, but there's a big Packer game today, but what time is the game?
3:30.
So I'm not gonna get in the way of the game.
No.
So no more than 3 hours.
Okay. Well, I have 2 Sundays too, so I can spread it out here.
On Tuesday.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's not a lot. Thank you. You too.
If those are our.
I see you've got sweets in there and pork.
So we can. Yeah. I'll send you the link.
Yeah.
All right, well, welcome everybody. I'll get us started here, but we had a couple of openings here for 2 Sundays where there wasn't any forum. And I had done the work on this for this presentation last October. And we thought, well, hey, why not? You know, we can present it again. So I think Wayne and Joe were there. I don't know if anybody else was able to make it to, Dottie was there. Gosh, and you came back again. Bless you.
Takes a while for me to come. I need it repeated.
Got it all.
But I think, you know, there's been a lot of interest in questions about, you know, what are we talking about with the Bible and our understanding of that? And so we thought, hey, why not? Let's share this. So I'm glad to present this again. And I think what I tried to do in just a single evening there, which is kind of a tall order, we'll even stretch out over the next couple of weeks. So today, what we don't hit today, we'll pick up on next Sunday as well. So my first slide that I wanted to share is maybe kind of an unusual one with this picture of the earth. But part of why I wanted to include that with talking about the Bible is sometimes we think of the Bible as kind of an otherworldly thing. You know, like we're going to engage into this mysterious kind of thing that's going to take us off into some other realm, you know, or something like that. But the more that I read the Bible and the more that I work with it, it is about our world. Wendell Berry has said, the place to really read the Bible is outside. When you're outside in God's creation, you hear things that are included there in a very different way than we're used to kind of hearing the Bible in a very ritualized way during worship, when we're all sitting in rows, staring straight ahead, the word of the Lord, thanks be to God, you know, and we say all those things, but it's like, there's such richness that's there. And so I just want to try to help prime your imagination a little bit to think about the earth, about our planet, about our world. And the other thing, does anyone know about the history of this picture?
Earthrise.
Earthrise is what it's called. Yeah, anyone remember when that was taken?
Oh, man.
Apollo 13. No.
So it was the Apollo 8 mission taken on December 24th, 1968. And so it was the first time that human beings had left Earth's orbit and they orbited the moon and returned. And so it's kind of, and it's known as Earthrise. And so that was kind of a momentous occasion, I think, for Earthlings to see our planet from space, you know, and to actually have a sense of what it looked like. And I think now maybe generations after this might even take that for granted, that we know what that looks like, you know, or what that's all about. But it's kind of an amazing thing to be able to see our planet, to see our world. And the scriptures testify to us that God loves the world. And what does it mean for us to love the world, as well, and to care for the world? And so I think a picture is worth 1,000 words. And I feel like this is a really important one. But there's another one that I want to share with you as well. Anybody know who that guy is?
It looks familiar.
He looks familiar? Is he a member of Faith?
No.
No. His name is William Anders. And he was the Apollo 8 astronaut who took that photo.
Okay.
That's him. And he died. He died just last year in 2024, in June of 2024 at the age of 90. So the other thing that I wanted to share is somebody took that picture. This guy. He's not all that different. I mean, he's an astronaut, and everything like that, but he gets old too, right? He probably had his body wear out. Maybe he had aches and pains. Maybe he got tired, and stuff, or worn out or weary. But and he died. Astronauts don't live forever. He was born and he died. But he saw that and he took a picture and he shared a story that touched people's imagination. And I wanted to share William Anders's picture because that's important too when we're talking about the Bible. Stories are important. Testimonies are important. The things that you see and tell and share with others. And it isn't something that just stops a long time ago, but it continues. God's love for the world is dynamic and active and it's alive. And we get to participate in that. And so here's an example of someone who he told a story and he shared a story and we got to see it. There's a really cool thing. If you have a little spare time, NASA has this, they have the recording of the astronauts and they're orbiting the moon. And he was taking pictures of the surface so that for mapping it, and kind of looking at that. But he looked up and saw the Earth and he's like, oh, I got to get this. And he grabbed the camera and he started snapping away. And you can listen to that recording and there's like a computerized animated recreation of kind of what it looked like. It's just fascinating, but there's a story there. So I want you to keep those things in mind as we talk about the Bible and the history of the Bible and what this means for us now. So I guess all of this is to say, oftentimes we think of the Bible in really, really restricted, kind of narrow ways that maybe we might even think, well, what does that even have to do with me? I don't even care about it. It doesn't even matter. Or it's so rigid and, restrictive and everything. It's just a bunch of rules or something like that. I don't want to listen to that. Trying to get our imaginations thinking more broadly about our world and the stories that we share and mystery and wonder in the midst of our world as well. The other thing I'm kind of mindful of, this is like I'm going to look at my friend Cindy here, a data dump. I went kind of wild, with going and finding, to talk about the history of the Bible, there's a lot, to talk about. So I'm going to be yakking up here for a while, but if you have any questions, I want to hear what you're thinking as well and your thoughts and your insights for the conversation, that we can share this together. But any initial responses just with some of those images and thinking about that? Okay, yeah, Jackie.
His pin is, or his pin says.
It is NASA. Looks like a rocket.
Man, I pulled this off the internet and I can't quite tell. I don't know. It may be a rocket. I'm not sure. It's kind of hard to see.
There's a combine in the background.
Where?
He's on a farm and that's maybe a big piece of farm equipment.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Is it?
In the Bible, that's where you can find it.
The illustrated.
All right. So do you all remember this guy? I wanted to share this picture of Billy Graham because sometimes when we talk about the Bible, see that pose that he's in, and that kind of charismatic thing where you've got a Bible in your hand, preferably made out with leatherette, floppy, And that is kind of the image, that we have of the charismatic preacher who's holding the Bible and is declaring the word of the Lord and is gonna, I'm gonna tell you what it is, and it's gonna be all about that. And we sometimes might think about the Bible like, well, it's this mystical thing and it just floated down from heaven right into Billy Graham's hand, in the King James Version with the words of Christ in red, and there it is, and I'm going to tell you what God has to say to you, and here it is. This is it. So I put that picture up here because that is an iconic image. I think it's in our imaginations when we think about what is the Bible, what's that all about. But for your consideration, I want to share with you another image here of a library. And I think as we look at the Bible and think about what it is really much more a collection of writings and documentation and stories and history and literature and recounting from a long, long period of time. And so sometimes too, I don't know if any of you would think of when you go into a library and you think, you know what? I really ought to read the entire library. That choice, with some exceptions, But oftentimes we maybe don't think about the library that way, but it's more like, well, I'm looking for something or I'm interested in something. And I respect this, that the library is this collection of all of this history, this story, all of this work that's been done throughout time, that's knowledge that's gathered here together. But, we can sometimes maybe beat up on ourselves like, well, I ought to read my Bible more. Think of it like a novel, or something like that. But it's not a novel. It's written over a period of thousands of years by many, many different authors who come from many, many different kinds of contexts. And there's a lot of complexity, and a lot of layers that go into it. So I would maybe, rather than Billy Graham in the pulpit with holding his Bible, think when we talk Bible of library, and a collection, a gathering of many, many resources from over a long period of time. And also one that is very unique and special because it is, as we talked about in worship today, the Spirit of God who is working in this, that is instrumental, and reflected in what's being shared here. So the other thing I found out with our October presentations is my colleagues were showing videos from our confirmation classes, and that was quite popular. So I'm going to do that as well. Let's see if I can get this to work.
Who wrote the Bible? God or humans?
So, the Bible. The Holy Bible. Yes, the Holy Bible. The Word of God. You've seen it. Your pastor talks about it. You may have even read some of it. But where did it come from? Did God just decide one day to self-publish an autobiography? Conjured the whole thing out of thin air and sent it to Earth to bless all humanity?
Heads up!
Ooh, leatherette. Or was the Bible written by humans who tried their best to guess at what God would want to say? 2 chickens does not equal that of a hamster. Thus saith the Lord. No. God wouldn't say that. What about a marmot? Christians believe that the Bible is inspired by God. But what does that mean? If you look at the meaning of the word inspired, first you have in, which means in.
Really?
And spire, which means to breathe. So, inspired by God essentially means to be breathed into by God.
That's weird.
So, basically, what happened is, a long time ago, a bunch of people were chosen by God to be breathed into, or inspired with God's message. In the Old Testament, these people were called prophets. The people who shared the good news of Jesus were called apostles. And these people went all over exclaiming God's message. And the things they were saying was some really amazing stuff. At some point, it crossed someone's mind that all of the stuff these inspired people were talking about should be written down. So they did. They started carefully writing all of this stuff down and refining and editing and transcribing all of it over several hundred years until they had a massive pile of this really amazing stuff. Whew. Now here's where it gets a little tricky. You see, there wasn't just one person writing this stuff down, and while most of it was truly inspired, some of it was, well, not so inspired. And the cantaloupe shall be cast aside lest you be consumed by your own armpits. This left the young church with a big problem. How would they sort out all of the inspired stuff from the not so inspired stuff? This is how the process of biblical canonization came into existence. What is canonization, you may ask?
Canon a what?
Well, that's where they took a wall.
Okay.
And a lot of glue, and they put the glue on the wall, then they took all the writings and stuffed them into a cannon and shot the cannon at the wall. And everything that stuck to the wall went into the Bible.
Really?
No. Canonization was a process guided by God in which church councils were formed to decide what writings were truly inspired by God. These councils prayerfully researched and analyzed and sifted through the early Christian writings using specific tests and definitions to establish their credibility. So they would ask important questions like, is this writing actually being used by the Christian community? Another key question they'd ask is, was this written by an apostle? Or a close associate of an apostle? Or Aunt Gertrude's son-in-law's stepsister's cousin? These kinds of tests and definitions helped to establish what books were a true witness to an active, moving God and the life of Jesus Christ, and should be included in what we now know as the Bible. The Holy Bible. Written by humans, inspired by God. Sweet.
There we go. Yeah, Julie.
The Bible convicts you of sin. It really, you read it and it convicts you of sin, and it changes your whole perspective on
Yeah.
what to do with.
So, this video was trying to offer a little bit of a humorous take on what is something that is very serious too, where we talk about, it's a belief statement that we have that God speaks to us through this. And I think that's something we would all agree on, here, as part of the church, where that's what we say each Sunday is, this is the word of the Lord. And so not only does that word convict us, but it also, it's law and gospel. There is also that word of redemption, of salvation that comes through that word as well. And we would even say that this word has become flesh, and lived among us in Jesus, the living word, the one who is among us. But I wanted to share that because I think it is helpful, to kind of think about, well, what is that story? And I think what is inspiring to me about that as well is that we can't know that story and we can't know God without community, without each other. There is, and community is messy and complicated and difficult. We don't all agree all the time, and the story of the Bible is one of profound disagreement and a lot of battles and arguments, that happened over a long, long period of time as well. But also it's the story of God's faithfulness, and the testimony that people have shared, sometimes at great cost, of what it is that a message of love for the world that God has to say. And so, yes, Julie, you're right. The Bible it convicts us of our sin, but it also raises us up. It raises up a new creation, and makes us who we are as the Word of God. And so what we're going to do, over these next 2 weeks it's a chance for me kind of to step out of just my preacher role, but to think about, well, what is this thing, and where did it come from? What's that history of how God has been at work, bringing that all together? And I think it's a really amazing story. As I reflect on it more and more, I appreciate more and more deeply what it is that the Bible does in our lives, and how that's at work, how God uses that in our lives. Yeah, any other thoughts on that? Okay. So the other thing I was going to say, I forgot to bring my little book, but I'm indebted with this to a little book by one of my professors at Luther Seminary, Craig Kester, who wrote a book called A Beginner's Guide to Reading the Bible. And it's still in print if you're ever interested in that. Yeah, but it's very helpful and just kind of a nice synopsis of what we're dealing with. So, when we say the Bible, a couple thoughts on this of how that gets viewed. One is what we were just talking about as a book of faith, of God speaking to us through this, and a means by which God addresses the world and communicates. It's a holy book, a sacred book, a book of faith. It's also a source of authority, so sometimes it's interesting, even in our society. I don't know if this still happens, but if you're gonna testify in a legal hearing, that you would, at least on TV shows, maybe, what do you put your hand on? Or when our new president is going to take the oath of office, he's probably going to put his hand on a Bible. And why? Why would you do something like that? Well, it's seen as a source of authority, that there's something important here, or something that makes a difference in the world that we need to listen to, we need to pay attention to. And so that's another a way of looking at the Bible. Another way we don't always stop and think about, but it's as literature. It's beautiful. There are just beautiful passages. There's other kind of confounding ones that it's like, what in the world does that mean? But it's a window into long time ago. And it gives us a sense of kind of being human over a long period of time. And those aren't the only ways, of viewing the Bible, but I just bring that up to say the Bible has occupied a lot of different roles kind of in our society. It's kind of interesting too. Biblical literacy is really on the decline. And I think college English departments are lamenting that, not because they're Christian necessarily, but because so much of English literature is indebted to the Bible, actually. And you don't know what it's being taught. They're making references to things that was just assumed, in previous generations. Who would have known those stories? Don't know them anymore. We don't know the stories. We aren't reading them or sharing them, or people aren't in church. And so that's an interesting little detail of where we are right now too. So when we talk about the Bible, one way of just kind of looking at it is to kind of break this down a little bit. So at the beginning, let's see here, is what's known as the Pentateuch or the Torah. And that would be a way, where we think about our relationship with our Jewish sisters and brothers. That sometimes Christians forget about that there would be no church, there would be no Christianity without Judaism. And the scriptures that were shared that the early church used were all what we understand as what we call the Old Testament. And so Pentateuch, it just means like 5 books, but that's a scholarly kind of term. But Jews would call it the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, or the first 5 books of Moses. Of helping kind of tell that foundational story of creation, of the patriarchs and matriarchs, the early kind of covenant, the sojourn into Egypt and exodus from Egypt, the wandering in the wilderness, the giving of the law, all of those different things are part of what is known as the Torah. And so Jewish people to this day, that's central for them. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are considered the Torah. And then there's also other kind of history or writings. And so these tell the story of like Israel coming into the promised land, of the development of judges who were leading the people, but then leading into having kings and constructing a temple and settling in Jerusalem, of a split in the kingdom into a northern and a southern kingdom, of exile and return again, and attempts to rebuild the temple and rebuild Jerusalem. Those are all that history is in these books of Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and our favorite book, Esther. And then there's also something known as wisdom literature that's included. And this kind of encompasses a lot of different like worship material that was used with Israel's worship in the temple, but also in devotional life. But also those sages who reflected on questions of what does it mean to serve God in our world? And what do we do with difficult questions, where, well, does everything that happened in the world mean that was what God wanted and God just dictated it and then that's what happened? Or is it more complicated than that? And so you start delving into some of these books and they ask questions. Actually, really, really relevant questions to our modern imaginations, I think, if we were willing to read these a little bit more. They get deep, really deep, and they'll stretch you and challenge you, with a lot of these things. But God, why have you allowed these disasters to happen? There's lament, in some of these writings, crying out to God, a rich, rich tradition. But that would include books like Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. Song of Solomon, by the way, one of the confirmation classes a couple years back, they were really interested to discover that there was a part of the Bible where your parents probably wouldn't want you to read some of that stuff. And they all grabbed their Bibles and were starting to. The other was, I remember one time, some reading from Song of Solomon in a worship service where the reader had obviously not looked at it beforehand and started reading, and you could just see the reader was male. And his face just started turning red. It gets really explicit, actually. But that's part of the Bible too. Sexuality is part of the Bible, and relationships and love is part of the Bible. And then finally, prophets. And so these are from spanning a long, long period of time, individuals who were seized by the Spirit of God to share a message, that they needed to say something in the midst of kind of that religious practice and religious structure when things were not going the way that they should, or when people had lost hope and they needed a new vision of what God was up to. Prophets were people that God sent to speak the word of the Lord to the people. And so this was, someone had put it one time that the task of preachers or prophets is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. And so both of those things are kind of true. When we get too complacent and too comfortable, we need those words of prophets to shake things up and say, as Julie was saying, to convict us of our sin. But we can't live in despair. We can't live in despondency and hopelessness, and we need prophets who help us to imagine the realm of God, the ways of God. So all of these are things this is all old, what we call Old Testament. This would have all been kind of part of those scriptures that the early church meant when they said, when they read the Bible, when they talked about that. And then, of course, there also is the New Testament and the story of that early church and how that all came together. So we have Gospels, our canon, Cananoa, that has 4, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that tell the story of Jesus. There's also history in our New Testament, the Acts of the Apostles. And then the remainder of the New Testament it consists of letters, or sometimes we'll call that epistles. So most of these are by the Apostle Paul, but some are pseudonymous, that are written maybe in the name of a famous figure, but they weren't maybe necessarily written by that figure, or some are anonymous. The author is not given. So Hebrews is actually one where there's no author that is named, with that. So we don't know who wrote Hebrews. But others do identify the author with them. But mostly it's Paul, but there's some other figures as well from the early church. The other thing that I wanted to share, and this is really important, we sometimes miss this maybe because the Bible has come to occupy a central place in Western civilization. It has really, really influenced great literature, governments, kind of a lot of our thinking. But the rise and fall of great empires is less important in the Bible, in the narrative of the Bible, than the story of people otherwise overlooked by history, who were chosen to carry out God's redemptive purposes. So when you think Israel and the covenant and the early church, these are not huge superpower, kinds of things that are like dictating world events, and causing all these are nobodies, actually. I mean, we look at them through the lens of kind of looking backward on history and thinking about what happened, but they were not people who were recognized by the powers of the world at their time. But what kind of gives the Bible its energy is God chose these people to say, I am going to be your God and you will be my people. And through you, I will bless all the nations of the world. I have something here to share. But it's ordinary people who probably would otherwise not be remembered by history. I think that's really, really important to keep in mind. And so we don't just kind of get in a dismissive mindset of thinking, well, who am I? Because God was only speaking and all that stuff long ago, and it was so clear and so dramatic, but I'm nothing, No, God is speaking in every generation and has things to say to you and is working through you, just like God was working through all of the people who were part of this amazing narrative spanning millennia, long period of time. Any thoughts on that or comments on that? Yeah, Esther.
So just kind of what came to mind is, there's really an obsession with trying to find some kind of text that mentions the historical Jesus, and it's just not there.
No.
And so to me, that's like almost the ultimate example of this. That during his lifetime, he was not recognized enough to be cited by any of the historians of the Roman Empire or any of the local history.
Right. Another quote that I like to kind of refer to, I mean, it's maybe a little bit offensive, but it tells you something about what the early church was like. But there's a correspondence between two Roman leaders who made a reference to Christianity, and the one disparaged it and said, that's nothing but a religion of women and slaves. The nobodies, the people who are on the market, women, it's all about men. This is male patriarchy. And slaves, those are not people who have any power. But those were the people who were gathered around the gospel in the early church, and they recognized something there. And there was energy, and there was something that was emerging and growing. And to this day, this is the power. I mean, so back, Julie, I'm going to go back to your point again about the Bible does things. So the very people who were oppressed by a Western interpreted Bible by slaveholders in our country, who used the Bible as justification to say slavery is God's will, that human beings should own other human beings, and that some human beings should be less than. Those very people who were being oppressed by that read the Bible and saw what was really there. And that has formed the great legacy of the Black church to this day, where it is a liberating message. So if you want to keep a people down, don't give them the Bible. Don't let them read the Bible, because it's going to set people free. It's going to mess things up. It'll mess you up. It'll do things. This is what Mary sang when she found out about this message. Oh God, you have brought down the powerful from their thrones, and you have lifted up the lowly. You've turned it all around. And so this is the testimony, the work, that's going with this. It is powerful stuff. It's liberating stuff. Yeah, thank you, Esther. Yeah.
Like Psalm 72 for that.
Yeah, all over the place. I mean, I would even say every verse of the Bible, you can find that. But yes, and the other thing, as we talk about the Bible, you all have your own story with that as well, in your own relationship, and probably passages where you've turned to and you found help, you found encouragement and life and liberation, freedom, that has come from that. And hopefully it isn't something that just comes in a vacuum, you know, where you're all alone, but in the community of God's people that's gathered together, we hear a word of life, a word of hope. And sometimes it comes in surprising ways, you know, you wouldn't even expect. Sometimes it's easy. You can probably tell this about me. I get resistant to anything that's real formulaic, you know, and to say, well, if you want to hear God say blah, 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 then turn to blah, 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 you know, and just read this. Or it's like, it's not like a doctor's prescription or something like that, but it's a story that we're invited into, you know, to share, and it meets you, it'll encounter you, where you're at. Yeah, thanks. Okay. So this will get into maybe a little bit of like the video had of warning you. But or that could be like, oh, this is really interesting. Can anyone kind of remember from your study of world history, the Bronze Age? Yeah. Anyone around from the Bronze Age? Wayne, were you alive in the Bronze Age? Oh, no, that was, sorry. Why did I do that? Let's see. So the Bronze Age was approximately 3,300 to 1,200 BCE, before the current era. So we're talking, you know, 2,000 to 3,000 years before the time of Jesus, you know, before that kind of orienting thing. So it was a time of bronze tools and weapons. The first writing systems began to emerge. There was the invention of the wheel, was the big new technology that happened at that time. The Sumerian Epic of Gilgamesh is an interesting document from history about kind of the gods and the creation of the world and how that all came to be. There was also the first legal code. So King Hammurabi in Babylon, they had the first kind of system of law, actually, of human beings forming laws, you know, and kind of forming other societies. And you also see kind of the stories of Greek mythology going way, way, way back, you know, the roots of that. And I keep looking at Mike Isbell, my history teacher, but Mike, is there anything you'd like to add about it? Okay. Well, so we're talking during the Bronze Age. So this is scholars would estimate like around between 2000 and 1700 BCE. During that time, that was probably around the time that Abraham and Sarah and their descendants began their migration to Canaan. And so they came from what it would be today, Iraq, kind of around that area. And famously, you know, the stories recount that Abraham heard God saying, Abraham, I will be your God and you will be my people. Go to the land that I will show you. And so he left his gods, his family and his people, and he took his crew and off they went. And they didn't really know where they were going. And that narrative is kind of recounted in the Torah. And this would have been a time when all of these stories were oral circulation. You know, writing was just beginning to emerge at this time. So this would have been nomadic peoples who told stories and recounted those stories with each other. So we get a little bit further. So there is eventually the settling and there's the birth of children. So remember with the story, of course, famously of Abraham and Sarah, they were old. And yet God called them and had made this promise. And they're like, well, how is this going to happen? Because we're past the time of childbearing, right? But, and they did all kinds of conniving, including Sarah saying, here, sleep with my servant and have a child that way, you know, and all these ways. But eventually Isaac is born, whose name means laughter. And there is that faithfulness, that promise, and there are descendants. And so we eventually get to, anyway, read your Bibles with that. There's a lot of drama in those stories. But eventually, Jewish Israel, the people of this covenant, Israel is Jacob's new name that he takes, but they go to Egypt. And eventually there's a period of slavery and things are good there for a while, but then they're not so good. And so Israel is actually sojourning for a long time in Egypt. And then we get Moses, this amazing figure from the Old Testament. He is sent, well, and of course we know about Moses' story about he actually grows up in Pharaoh's house. He's found in the river in the basket. And here again, think oral stories. You can just kind of hear that when you read in the Torah. He kills an Egyptian and he flees for his life, but then God meets him and says, I'm sending you back there again. And I want you to go to Pharaoh and say, let my people go. Exodus, this great source of liberation, this liberating message of God versus Pharaoh, God versus imperial power, political power, the way that we like to exert our will, and do things. What does it mean to trust in God in the midst of all of that and that demonstration? And they wander in the wilderness, and there's the law is given on Sinai, the 10 Commandments. And again, none of this has been written down. This is all oral circulation, all stories being told. And then finally, there is Joshua. Moses dies, and the judges take over and lead with Israel, and there's conquest as they go into the promised land to go and settle in this promised land. So this is still kind of Bronze Age, the end of the Bronze Age, here. And then I want to mention here too, so some of these figures, Deborah was actually, there were female judges as well. And Samson is another one that is a legendary figure. You remember Samson and his hair, not like me. I will never have great strength like Samson, but and Samuel, the prophet Samuel, or the judge Samuel. So all those things. Okay, so now we start moving into the Iron Age. Anyone born in the Iron Age? That was from 1200 to about 600 BCE. And this would have been classical Greece, Socrates. When we think about figures like that Plato wrote about, the rise of democracy starts to kind of come. We see that of the city-state, the polis in classical Greece, also the Persian Empire to the east, and Cyrus the Great. And so there's kind of a shift in how things start happening here during this period of time. So during this time, Israel decides we want to have a king like everybody else. And so they end up having a united monarchy of all the 12 tribes, and Saul is the first king, followed by David and then Solomon, and a temple is constructed in Jerusalem. And so that's a real momentous event for Israel as a people. And so as this starts happening, we start to see the beginning of the very first parts of the Pentateuch, the Torah, are written down. So some of those stories that were only oral before that period start to get written. And then it doesn't last. The kingdom splits. And so there's a northern kingdom that's known as Israel and a southern kingdom that's known as Judah. So first, with the northern kingdom, we have prophets like Elijah and Elisha, Hosea and Amos. This was conquered by Assyria in 722 BCE. And more of the Pentateuch, or the Torah, is completed during this time, and the books of Hosea and Amos. So the prophets, Hosea and Amos, were written down at that time. And then in the southern kingdom, during the divided monarchy, that was known as Judah. So that was David's tribe. So you remember these names of all these sons of Israel were the names of these different tribes. And so today, to this day, when we say Jew, that's referring to Judah, to that one tribe, which was centered on Jerusalem and the temple and David. And so here we have figures like Isaiah and Micah and Jeremiah. Jerusalem was conquered by Babylonia in 587 BCE. This is a period when the first half of the prophet Isaiah was written, also the prophets Micah, Jeremiah, Deuteronomy, and many Psalms were written during this time. And then after these territories are seized by these other imperial powers, there's a period of exile. And I kind of mentioned that in the sermon today. And the prophet Ezekiel emerges during that time. Then the book of Ezekiel is written. And this is now a time when the rug is pulled out from, life had been, there had been a lot of energy centered in things like a temple and a united monarchy, but then it was divided and things hadn't gone good and there was conquering. And now we don't even have a homeland anymore. Jewish people are in a diaspora. They're spread out all over the place, where we need to write down, we need to collect and gather our worship life. And there is no temple at this point to go and worship in, no place to bring sacrifices. So you see the rise of the synagogue and the rabbi, and having documents that would be read in a worship service, where we remember what happened and we yearn to go back again, to come back. But that's part of that coming together. Note that we are still 500 years or so before the time of Jesus, when this is happening here. And then Cyrus the Great, there's the time of the Persian period and the Persian Empire. Jews are allowed during that period to go back again to Jerusalem, and they start rebuilding a temple. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah are they tell that story of how that temple got rebuilt again. Chronicles and then the prophets Haggai, Zechariah, and Jonah are written during that period. And then what's known as the Hellenistic period. Anyone remember from your study of history Alexander the Great? So here we have Hellenistic or Greek culture that really becomes, that is the overwhelming force that ends up influencing trade, language, culture, everything, in a far, far reaching way, where Alexander's empire goes not just way far beyond Greece, and it reaches way out into the east. And so you start to find Greek then is the language that is spoken. And this is the period where, for the first time, the Old Testament, which was being written in Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, was translated into Greek. And that's known as the Septuagint. Sometimes you'll hear about that. And often the Bible that the early church was reading was that Greek translation of the Old Testament, of the Bible. And that's the period when Ecclesiastes is written. And then the Maccabean period, which takes us almost right up to the time of Jesus, when he was born. So there are other books, and we can talk a little bit more about this. Some of you have maybe heard of the Apocrypha before. And so there are some books that are not included in the canon of all churches, but those would document, so Maccabees are first and second Maccabees, and there's others there too that tell more of history from this period of time. But there were some dynastic shifts after Alexander died, and there was a ruler, Antiochus Epiphanes, who decided that the Jewish temple should have a statue of Zeus in it. And you can imagine how the Jews felt about that, to have Zeus in the temple. And they revolted. And Judas Maccabeus led the revolt, and they successfully purged the temple, and they reclaimed Israel as its own kind of an independent power. And Hanukkah, actually the celebration of Hanukkah, is what that's all about. That there was oil in the lamps, and they were able to purge and purify the temple, and they had enough oil to be able to light the sanctuary lights and have that. The Roman Empire starts to emerge in 63 BCE. Palestine comes under Roman control. We also, for the first time, start to see what's called apocalyptic literature, which some people have said that's prophecy, what the prophets were doing in a new idiom, where there's visionaries who would see fantastic visions of kind of the curtain being pulled back. Apocalypse means an unveiling. And so they see an unveiling of history, of God's hand in history, and all these fantastic things that are happening. And often apocalyptic literature emerges in times of a lot of persecution, when there's threats and things that are, this is where you start to see where the Roman Empire is dictating what can and can't happen, and people who react to that and respond to that. And so Daniel is kind of the first of a lot of that apocalyptic literature. And it's, you know, imagining kind of looking back to the exile of this figure, Daniel, who is a faithful person who trusts in God in the midst of persecution, and he sees all these things of God's action in human history. Yeah.
Just a quick, so was most of what we consider the Apocrypha written during this period?
Yes.
Is that what you said?
Yes, yes. Yep. Yeah.
I just recall, I recall somebody saying all the Old Testament was written before 400 BC, and then there were 400 years between.
You might get different people disagreeing kind of on those timelines, but the one that I was working with, I mean, eventually it wasn't until even the time of the early church when there was really finally consensus among a group of all kinds of rabbis to say, here's what our official scriptures will be. And that's that process. The things that were written, there were a lot of things that were written from many, many different places, but that's that process of how groups of people guided by God's Spirit decided, here's what the collection will include, you know, and then finally kind of having consensus on it and saying, yep, this is what we're going to. So you can't really pin, there was this thing called, I'll mention it later, called the Council of Jamnia, which that was where enough rabbis came together to agree and say, this is what that scripture will include. But by the time of Jesus, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself a little bit here, but Jesus would even refer to the law and the prophets, which is a way of saying the Torah and a collection of authoritative prophets, you know, who would be recognized. And so there were things that were widely recognized, but we're talking about a process that happens where it wasn't all written by one person, all bam, right at one time, and then you have it. It's right there. Which I think is really a powerful testimony to the working of God by the power of the Spirit, you know, of how those things are able to come together. That's an amazing thing.
I think you'd get argument from some people about if it was really just the Spirit of God that led to the selection of books.
Oh, right.
Just saying.
Well, right. That's a faith statement, I guess, you know, to say that. But yes, human beings being human beings. You know, and that's an interesting thing too, where we get to run into that in the church where, yeah, we believe that God is at work, but we can really be jerks sometimes. We can really be stubborn, you know, and really nasty to each other, you know, and sometimes we would even prefer that, you know, to listening to God. Let's have a good fight, you know, I mean, because then I can feel something a little bit more than that, blah, 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 you know, I want to feel it here. Let's mix it up. But yeah, somehow in the midst of all of that, we believe God is at work. That even in our sinfulness, even in our division, you know, God never gives up on us. God is always working and bringing that together. Part of why I'm excited to share this too, and I appreciate you sticking around, you know, to hear about it, is it's kind of complicated, but you might see me get testy sometimes when I have people who just want to throw out parts of the Bible, you know, or get rid of it, or why do we even bother with that anymore? I hate that part. I don't even want to read it. But it testifies to that truth of God never giving up on us. And we need to remember that story. We need to, and that doesn't mean that we aren't still listening, that we aren't still engaged. It's totally about that, you know, but I want to help people into that more. So sometimes if I bristle a little bit, you know, with some of that stuff, that's part of why, because I think we're missing something when we forget about that, when we overlook all that. Okay, I think I've got a few more minutes. I will get us out of here by noon, but so real quickly with the New Testament and kind of how that was formed. So before Jesus was born, we see now the Roman Empire, the Romans enter Jerusalem. The Herodian family, remember Herod the Great, becomes a governor who leads and is given power there, and other Roman governors are appointed. And Herod gets the favor of the Jewish people by building them a lavish temple. It is really a big fancy temple that's there. And that's mentioned in the Gospels as well. And then we get Jesus. He is born. He has a 3-year public ministry. He is put to death at the hands of the state. And we start to see accounts of Jesus' teachings and his ministry circulate orally. Again, all of Jesus' followers were Jews. So this new thing had not started spreading so much to Gentiles, other than we do hear accounts in the Gospels that there were Gentiles who were noticing and hearing. And Jesus would even say things like, wow, never in Israel have I seen such faith. And so you'll start to see those boundaries starting to get tested, you know, and it starts spreading out of this word of God going further. And then we get into early Christian missions, where the disciples now, this uneducated, frightened band, are suddenly very bold and standing up to leaders and rulers at cost of life and limb to go and preach the gospel. And they are empowered to do this. And they start forming other disciples. And these apostles go out into the ancient world, and churches start to form. And it's not only Jewish people, but there's Gentiles. And that's kind of the first great controversy that these early followers of Jesus had to deal with was, do you have to be a Jew to follow Jesus? And anyone know what the decision was? No, you don't have to. That was a radical thing. It was like, no, God's love actually is bigger than that. And so you don't have to, that means that males don't have to be circumcised in order to become a Christian. And so that was the way that kind of, and the other was you don't have to be kosher. You don't have to keep all of the food laws. There's a great scene where Peter has a vision, and he's got to go to the house of Cornelius, who's a Gentile. And he's like, oh, I don't do that. I keep myself kosher, but you're telling me God to go, and I need to go in there. So that's all kind of pushed. So all these are happening. So there's Jerusalem is kind of the center, but these churches are established. So then at this point in the 1st century, the Jews in Palestine revolt against Rome. So you remember this fancy ornate temple that Herod the Great had built. They revolt and they want to reassert their Jewish identity. And so the temple is destroyed for a final time. And the only thing that's left of it is known as the Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem today. But after this point, there will never be there's not a Jewish temple again. That's kind of an interesting political thing, you know, that some people like to speculate about, but that was a huge change for Jews from that point forward. No more temple. And that's a hotly contested site as well, because that's where Muhammad received his revelations. So it's sacred to Muslims as well. Yeah, so it's a hotly contested site. Interesting kind of a thing. And this is when, so Paul's letters were the first things in the New Testament to be written. And the Gospel of Mark now is written down. So the first Gospel, I can't emphasize this enough. It wasn't that there was somebody running around with a notepad, you know, following Jesus and hanging on Jesus every word to write it all down, or with a microphone, better yet. Jesus, can you tell us what you're saying here? I'm sure we get that. It's all recounted. So the gospel writers were remembering what he said and starting to put it down in a narrative form. Okay. So now we start to see, after this really big dramatic thing with Judaism, Christianity becomes increasingly distinct from Judaism. You start to see the paths kind of diverge. And that first generation of the disciples dies out. And Matthew, Luke, and Acts, they go together. They're both by the same author, and the Gospel of John are written. And then you start to see kind of consolidation of teaching. So you have these churches all over, and there's letters that were written to them. They had different gospels, you know, that they were sharing ways of telling Jesus and things that they told about Jesus. So you start to see those kind of patterns keep developing. First and Second Timothy, Titus, First, Second, and Third John, and Revelation were written at this time. This was a period when Christians were under intense persecution. So from Rome, the whole thing. Remember about getting fed to the lions, and gladiatorial games and things like that. Well, Christians were like the scum of the earth, and so, or they were blamed for different kinds of things. So that was kind of fun to put them in the gladiatorial arena, where they would get torn apart, because they're like women and slaves, this nobody group. Yeah, so you see a lot of trauma, a lot of persecution and struggle. And again, apocalyptic literature, of Revelation emerges at that time, of how do you hold on? How do you hold on to hope in the midst of all this? Okay. I think I will stop there, and then we'll pick up our next week with who decided which books belong in the Bible, getting into that whole discussion. I think people will like that because then it's always, everybody loves, it's like the internet, and well, how come the book of blah, 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 blah isn't written in the Bible or isn't included in the Bible? Because I like blah, 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 and I like blah, 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 and why isn't that there? But we'll get into that next week, so stay tuned. But thanks, everybody. Hopefully I wasn't too sassy with my teaching here and everything, but or disrespectful. I want to say, I want to bring a little bit of levity though into it, because I think our human nature is like that. And I really believe God never gives up on us. God keeps working, even in the midst of all those things that stand in the way, with a message of life. And the Bible is all about that. And that's something we get to share. It's a part of our life right now. Okay, thanks everyone. Come back again next time.
Yeah.
I don't know. Probably miss it later.
I would.
So.
Whatever you guys wanna do.
You're part of the guys.
Yeah, I know, but whatever you